The wind howled across the barren plains of southern Wyoming, carrying with it the taste of dust and forgotten dreams. Thomas McAllister stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun bleed crimson across the jagged peaks of the distant mountains. At 34, he had the weathered look of a man who'd spent more time conversing with cattle than people, his hands rough as bark, his eyes the color of winter sky. The ranch sprawled before him like a testament to stubborn endurance rather than prosperity. Sparse grass clung to the earth between patches of sage and rock, and the few head of cattle he managed to keep alive looked as lean and hard as the land itself. This was his inheritance, 160 acres of defiance against nature, left to him by a father who died coughing blood into a tin cup, still cursing the soil that never quite yielded enough. Thomas removed his hat, running fingers through hair already touched with premature gray. The evening ritual was always the same: check the stock, mend what needed mending, then retreat to the small cabin where silence waited like an old companion. But tonight, something pulled at him, a restlessness that had been building for weeks. Inside the cabin, he lit the oil lamp and settled at the rough-hewn table. From a drawer, he pulled out a stack of letters, their edges soft from handling. His own handwriting stared back at him from the topmost envelope, returned unopened, like all the others. No longer at this address, the postmaster's scrawl declared. 3 years of trying to find a wife through the matrimonial advertisements. 3 years of silence. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a blade. His younger brother Samuel, barely 16, burning with fever after the accident at the sawmill. Thomas had sold the good horses to pay for the doctor who arrived too late. Then their mother, Elizabeth McAllister, wasting away through 2 brutal winters, her coughs echoing through the cabin like accusations. He'd been 25 when she finally let go, her last words a plea for him to find happiness, to not die alone on this unforgiving land. "You gave too much, Thomas," she'd whispered, her hand cold in his. "Don't let this place take everything." But it had taken everything, hadn't it? The years when other men courted and married. He'd spent mixing poultices and heating broth. The money that might have bought finer clothes or paid for trips to town went to medicines and debts. By the time the earth had claimed the last of his family, Thomas had forgotten how to be anything other than a caretaker to ghosts. The townsfolk knew his story, spoke it in hushed tones at the general store. "Too quiet," the women said, clutching their baskets. "Odd one, that McAllister boy. Keeps to himself like he's hiding something." The men were no kinder. "Wouldn't know what to do with a woman if one fell from the sky." They'd chuckle over their whiskey at Murphy's saloon. Thomas had written his first letter after overhearing such talk. He'd labored over it for hours, his large hands cramping around the pen. Seeking a good woman of moral character for marriage, have 160 acres in Wyoming territory, small cabin, some cattle, can provide honest living. Age and appearance do not matter, only kindness required. Simple words from a simple man. He'd sent variations of this letter to 5 different matrimonial clubs back east, spending money he could ill afford on postage and hope. Some had been returned, marked undeliverable. Others simply vanished into the vast silence of the frontier postal system. He pushed the letters aside and stood, joints protesting from the day's labor. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkness. Thomas checked the rifle by the door, an old Spencer repeater that had belonged to his father, then stepped onto the porch. The night sky sprawled above him, stars thick as spilled salt. It was then he saw the rider approaching, barely visible in the moonlight. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle, but the rider called out. Old Pete Brennan from town, his voice whiskey rough but familiar. "McAllister, got something for you." Pete dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many years in the saddle. From his saddlebag, he produced a letter, water-stained and bearing the marks of a long journey. "Found this at the old postal station, the one that burned down last spring. Remember? They're still sorting through what survived. This here's addressed to you. Dated near 2 years back." Thomas took the envelope with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. His name was written across it in careful feminine script. In the lamplight, He read, Mr. Thomas McAllister, Southern Wyoming Territory. Dear Sir, I write in response to your advertisement seeking a wife. I must confess immediately that I am not what most would consider a suitable match. At 38 years of age, I am well past the bloom of youth that men desire. I have no fortune to bring, only willing hands and a determination to make a life, however humble. The letter was signed Miss Margaret O'Brien, Chicago, Illinois. Pete had tactfully retreated, leaving Thomas alone with the ghost of possibility. He read the letter 3 more times, each word sinking deeper. She wrote of her work as a governess, of her love for books and her ability to keep house. She made no pretense about her age or situation, stating plainly that she was seeking a chance for a different life, away from the judgment of those who see only what I lack. But it was the postscript that stopped his breath. I do not write to you out of desperation, Mr. McAllister, but out of hope. Perhaps 2 solitary souls might together find what has eluded them apart. 2 years. This letter had traveled for 2 years, survived fire and neglect, to reach him on this night when loneliness pressed against his ribs like a physical weight. Was she still in Chicago, still unmarried, still willing? Thomas spent the rest of the night composing his reply. Dawn found him at the post office in town, paying for the fastest delivery available. His letter was brief but heartfelt. Miss O'Brien, your letter has only just reached me. If you are still free and willing, I would be honored to welcome you as my wife. I can promise little beyond honest work, faithful companionship, and a home that, while simple, will be yours as much as mine. If you come, you will find in me a man who understands that some flowers bloom late but are no less beautiful for it. He sent the letter with a money order for her passage, knowing it might reach a woman now married, now dead, now disappeared into the vast anonymity of city life. But hope, once awakened, was a difficult thing to kill. 3 months later, as autumn painted the aspens gold, a telegram arrived. Departing Chicago, November 1st, stop arriving. Cheyenne, November 8th, stop M. O'Brien. Thomas read it standing in the dusty street, obvious to the stares of passers-by. She was coming. After all this time, through fire and years and impossible odds, Margaret O'Brien was coming to Wyoming, coming to him. That night, he began preparing the cabin with a fervor that surprised him. He built a proper bed frame to replace his straw tick on the floor. He ordered cloth for curtains from the general store, enduring Mrs. Morrison's knowing smile. He even planted late wildflower seeds along the porch, though frost would likely claim them before they bloomed. The land watched his preparations with its usual indifference, wind scouring the plains, mountains standing in their ancient judgment. But Thomas McAllister, for the first time in many years, found himself humming as he worked, old songs his mother used to sing, melodies he'd thought forgotten. Hope was a dangerous thing on the frontier. It could kill a man faster than winter or drought. But as Thomas touched the telegram in his pocket for the dozenth time, he decided that some dangers were worth embracing. Margaret O'Brien was coming, and with her, perhaps, a chance to live, rather than simply endure. The train wheezed to a stop at Cheyenne Station, belching black smoke into the November sky. Margaret O'Brien clutched her carpetbag with hands that trembled despite her best efforts at composure. Through the grimy window, she watched the platform fill with people, rough men in canvas pants, women with sun-hardened faces, children wild as prairie dogs. This was it. Then, the edge of civilization, the beginning of her new life. She had aged during the journey west, not in years, but in understanding. The comfortable railway cars of the eastern lines had given way to cramped, dusty coaches that rattled her bones. She'd seen plains that stretched beyond comprehension, mountains that scraped the belly of heaven, and towns that seemed to cling to existence by sheer stubbornness. Through it all, she'd kept Thomas McAllister's letter pressed between the pages of her Bible, reading it whenever doubt crept in. End of the line, ma'am. The conductor's voice jarred her from her reverie. She was the last passenger in the car, having delayed this moment as long as possible. Margaret stood, smoothing her traveling dress, a sensible gray wool that had seemed appropriate in Chicago, but now felt like mourning clothes. She'd sewn secret pockets into the lining, hiding what little money remained after purchasing necessities for the journey. Everything she owned fit into 2 bags, the carpet bag in her hand and a small trunk in the luggage car. 38 years of life reduced to what she could carry. The platform assaulted her senses, the smell of coal smoke and horse manure, the cacophony of voices, the bite of wind that cut through her coat like it was paper. She stood frozen, searching the crowd for a face she'd never seen, a man she knew only through carefully penned words. Mrs. O'Brien. She turned to find a tall man standing apart from the crowd, hat in hand. He was exactly as she'd imagined, and nothing like it at once. Weathered. Yes, with deep lines around eyes the color of winter morning. His clothes were clean but worn, his boots carefully polished despite the dust that seemed to coat everything here. But it was his stillness that struck her, a quality of waiting, as if he'd been standing in that spot for years. Miss O'Brien, she corrected gently, then felt heat rise in her cheeks. What did it matter? She'd come here to be his wife. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred soul who understood the weight of small distinctions. Thomas McAllister, he said, his voice low and careful, as if words were coins he couldn't afford to waste. They stood awkwardly, 2 strangers bound by letters and hope, while the world rushed around them. Margaret noticed his hands, large, work-scarred, but clean. Hands that had written of loneliness with surprising eloquence. Your trunk, he asked, and she nodded, grateful for the practical necessity that broke the spell. She followed him through the chaos, noting how people stepped aside without seeming to see him, a man used to moving through the world without disturbing it. They retrieved her trunk, which he lifted as if it weighed nothing, and made their way to a wagon waiting beside the station. It's a day's ride to the ranch, he said, helping her up to the bench seat with a careful touch to her elbow. We'll stop in Willow Creek. That's the nearest town to my place. Figured you might need some supplies. And he paused, color rising above his beard. Thought folks should see you proper, arriving as my intended. Margaret understood. In a small town, reputation was currency, and he was trying to protect hers from the start. The thoughtfulness of it made her throat tight. The wagon rolled out of Cheyenne, and Margaret got her first real look at the landscape that would be her home. The vastness of it stole her breath. In Chicago, buildings had hemmed in the sky, parceling it into manageable portions. Here, the horizon seemed to curve away into eternity, the land rolling in brown waves toward mountains that looked painted against the sky. They rode in silence for the first hour. The only sounds, the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clop of horses' hooves. Margaret stole glances at Thomas, trying to reconcile this flesh-and-blood man with the phantom she'd constructed from his letters. He handled the team with quiet competence, his profile stern but not unkind. It's beautiful, she said finally, needing to break the silence. Different from what I expected, but beautiful. He glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features. Most folks see only the hardship in it. I've seen enough false prettiness to appreciate honest country, she replied, thinking of the Chicago mansions where she'd worked, all gilt and polish hiding rot beneath. They stopped at a creek to water the horses, and Thomas produced a bundle from under the seat, bread, cheese, and apples that he divided carefully between them. They ate, standing beside the wagon, the November wind sharp but clean. I should tell you, Margaret began, then stopped. How to explain the circumstances that had driven her west? The child that had grown beneath her heart for 6 months before being born too soon, too small. The father who'd been the eldest son of her employer, engaged to a society belle, who'd sworn love until consequences made lies impossible. You don't need to tell me anything, Thomas said quietly. We all got histories. What matters is what comes next. The kindness of it nearly undid her. In Chicago, she'd been branded, whispered about, dismissed from her position with only a week's wages and no reference. Her own family had turned their backs. her father declaring her dead to him. But this man, this stranger, offered acceptance without questions. They reached Willow Creek as the sun began its descent. The town was smaller than Cheyenne, a collection of buildings huddled against the immensity of the landscape like survivors of a shipwreck. Margaret felt eyes on them as the wagon rolled down the main street, faces appearing in windows, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Thomas pulled up at the general store. "Thought you might need some things," he said. "For the house. I've been batching it so long, I might not know what's proper." Inside, Margaret moved carefully among the shelves, aware of the scrutiny from the proprietress, a sharp-faced woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Morrison. She selected basic items: soap, thread, a few spices Thomas's kitchen likely lacked. When she reached for a bolt of calico for curtains, Mrs. Morrison spoke. "You're the mail-order bride, then?" It wasn't a question. "Bit long in the tooth for it, aren't you?" Margaret's spine stiffened, but before she could respond, Thomas appeared at her elbow. "Miss O'Brien's age suits me fine," he said, his tone mild but final. "That'll be all we need." "Mrs. Morrison." The woman subsided, but Margaret caught the look she exchanged with another customer. Speculation mixed with something less kind. Outside, loading their purchases, she heard the whispers start. "Poor thing, must be desperate. At her age. What choice did she have? McAllister's odd enough. Maybe they suit." Thomas heard them too. She could tell by the way his jaw tightened, but he said nothing until they were back on the road. Then, quietly, "I'm sorry for that. Small towns got small minds sometimes." "I've heard worse," Margaret said, which was true. The name she'd been called in Chicago still echoed in her nightmares. "I didn't come here expecting easy." They drove on as darkness gathered, Thomas producing lanterns from the wagon bed. The temperature dropped precipitously, and Margaret pulled her coat tighter, trying not to shiver. Without a word, Thomas handed her a buffalo robe from behind the seat. "Almost there," he said, and she heard something in his voice. Nervousness, perhaps, or hope. The ranch materialized from the darkness like something conjured. A small cabin with light glowing in one window, a barn and corral, a few outbuildings. It was modest to the point of severity, but the fence posts stood straight. The yard was clear of debris, and smoke rose welcoming from the chimney. Thomas helped her down, his hands lingering a moment on her waist to steady her on ground stiff with frost. "It ain't much," he began, but she stopped him. "It's a home," she said firmly. "That's more than I had yesterday." He carried her trunk inside while she stood in the doorway, taking in her new world. The cabin was one large room with a loft above, a cook stove in one corner, a fireplace in another. The furniture was handmade but solid. A table, 2 chairs. Had he built the second recently? A rocking chair by the fire. Everything was scrupulously clean, and she noticed small touches of preparation. A rag rug before the hearth, curtains on the single window, wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, though frost had blackened their edges. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," Thomas said, setting down her trunk. Until we're properly married. There's a preacher comes through Willow Creek every few weeks. Or we could go to Cheyenne if you prefer." Margaret turned to face him, this good man who offered her dignity along with shelter. "Thank you," she said simply, meaning more than just the sleeping arrangements. He nodded, understanding, then showed her where things were kept. Water bucket, wood box, coffee and provisions. At the door, he paused. "I'm glad you came," he said, the words seemingly pulled from some deep place. I'd about given up hoping. Then he was gone, leaving Margaret alone in the cabin that would be her home. She sat on the trunk, hands folded in her lap, and let the tears come. Not from sorrow, but from relief so profound it felt like grief. She had made it. Against all odds and expectations, she had traveled across a continent to this small shelter against the vastness of Wyoming. Outside, she could hear Thomas moving about in the barn, getting settled for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to cook on a wood stove, hauling water, facing the townspeople's scrutiny. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Margaret O'Brien felt something she'd thought lost forever, the possibility of belonging. She unpacked slowly, hanging her few dresses on pegs, setting her mother's Bible on the table beside the wildflowers. Her fingers traced the worn cover, remembering her mother's words. Love comes when it will, Margaret, not always when we're young and foolish enough to trust it. Perhaps her mother had been right. Perhaps some loves needed the tempering of years and sorrow to recognize their worth. Margaret looked around the simple cabin, at the evidence of a man's solitary life and his awkward attempts to ready it for her arrival, and felt her heart crack open just a little, like ice beginning its spring thaw. Winter descended upon Wyoming with the inevitability of judgment. Margaret woke each morning to frost painting elaborate patterns on the cabin window, her breath visible in the cold air until Thomas, who rose before dawn to tend the stock, had coaxed the stove back to life. She'd been at the ranch 3 weeks now, and her hands bore the evidence. Blisters from the axe handle, cuts from kindling, burns from the temperamental stove that seemed to sense her inexperience. "You're holding it wrong," Thomas said one morning, finding her struggling with the splitting maul. He moved behind her, his large hands covering hers on the handle. "Like this. Let the weight do the work." It was the closest they'd been since her arrival. She could smell wood smoke and leather, feel the solid warmth of him through the cold air. The logs split cleanly, and she felt absurdly proud. "I'll learn," she said, meaning more than just wood splitting. "I know you will." He stepped back, that careful distance between them restored. They lived like polite strangers sharing a boarding house. Him sleeping in the barn, despite the plummeting temperatures. Her alone in the cabin that still felt more his than theirs. The learning curve was steep. In Chicago, she'd turned a gas valve for heat, bought bread from the baker, drew water from indoor taps. Here, everything required forethought and labor. Water meant breaking ice on the barrel, then hauling buckets from the well. Bread meant wrestling with sourdough starter Thomas's mother had begun 20 years ago, keeping it alive like a temperamental pet. Laundry meant heating water on the stove, scrubbing until her knuckles cracked and bled, hanging clothes that froze solid on the line. But there were small victories too. The first morning her biscuits rose properly. Thomas's eyes widened in surprise. "These are fine," he said, and she treasured the words like coins. When she successfully mended his torn shirt with stitches so small they nearly disappeared. He ran his fingers over the repair with something like wonder. They developed routines without discussing them. She rose when she heard him stirring in the barn, had coffee ready when he came in to warm himself before morning chores. He kept the wood box filled without being asked, brought in snow for her to melt for washing. Evenings, they sat by the fire, him oiling harness or mending tools, her sewing or reading from her Bible. Sometimes he'd ask her to read aloud, his eyes closing as her voice filled the silence. The shooting lesson came after the incident with the coyote. She'd been hanging wash when the animal appeared, lean and desperate with winter hunger, eyeing the chickens Thomas had bought for eggs, though she suspected they were mostly for her benefit. She'd shouted and waved her arms, but the creature stood its ground until Thomas appeared with the rifle, firing over its head to scare it off. "You need to know how to handle this," he said that evening, setting the Spencer rifle on the table. "I won't always be close enough." He taught her to load, aim, fire. The rifle kicked against her shoulder like an angry mule, leaving bruises she hid beneath high collars. But by the week's end, she could hit a tin can at 20 paces. "You're a natural," Thomas said, and she saw something new in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition that she wasn't as fragile as her city breeding might suggest. The trip to town for supplies tested their fragile equilibrium. Margaret had darned and redarned her gloves, but Thomas noticed her reddened hands as she climbed into the wagon. "We'll get you proper work gloves," he said. "Should have thought of it sooner." In Morrison's general store, the whispers followed them like smoke. 2 women by the fabric counter made no effort to lower their voices. Living in sin, they are. No preacher's been through to marry them proper. At her age, probably grateful for any man who'd have her. Margaret's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high, selecting items with deliberate care. When they reached the counter, Ed Morrison, quieter than his sharp-tongued wife, tallied their purchases with obvious reluctance to meet their eyes. It happened as they were leaving. A man Margaret didn't recognize, young, with the flushed face of afternoon drinking, blocked their path. Well, McAllister's mail-order woman. His eyes traveled over her with insolent familiarity. Bit old for the catalog, ain't you? Must have been on sale. Thomas went very still beside her. Step aside, Carter. Just being friendly like. Carter reached out as if to touch Margaret's cheek, wanting to welcome the lady proper. Thomas moved faster than Margaret would have thought possible. One moment Carter was leering at her. The next, he was on the ground, blood streaming from his nose. Thomas stood over him, fists clenched. You don't look at her. You don't speak to her. You don't come near her. His voice was low, dangerous. Understood? Carter scrambled away, cursing. The street had gone silent, everyone watching. Thomas took Margaret's elbow, gentle despite the violence seconds before, and helped her into the wagon. They rode in silence until the town disappeared behind them. Then Thomas pulled the horses to a stop. I'm sorry, he said, staring at his hands. I shouldn't have. That wasn't right. Using my fists. My mother raised me better. You defended me, Margaret said softly. No one's ever done that before. He looked at her then, something raw in his expression. You're under my protection now. That means something out here. That night, she found him sitting on the porch despite the cold, the rifle across his knees. You'll freeze, she said, just keeping watch, in case Carter gets stupid ideas. She went inside and returned with 2 cups of coffee and the buffalo robe. Then I'll watch with you. They sat side by side in the darkness, not touching but aware of each other. The stars wheeled overhead, brilliant in the clear air. A wolf howled somewhere in the mountains, answered by another. Why did you really come? Thomas asked suddenly. Your letter said you wanted a different life, but that ain't the whole truth, is it? Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Does it matter? No, just, I figure we're both running from something. Might as well be honest about it. She told him then, in the darkness that made confession easier, about the Pemberton household where she'd served as governess, the eldest son, James, with his laughing eyes and pretty promises, how she'd believed him when he spoke of marriage, of defying his parents, how quickly those promises evaporated when her condition became apparent. They said I'd corrupted him. His mother called me, names I won't repeat. I lost the baby at 6 months, almost died myself. When I recovered, I had no position, no reference, no family who'd claim me. Her voice stayed steady through practice. Your advertisement seemed like a door opening when all others had slammed shut. Thomas was quiet for long minutes. Then, my brother died because of me. The words hung in the cold air. Margaret waited. I was supposed to be watching him at the mill. Got distracted, talking to a girl. Samuel always was curious about machinery, the saw blade. He stopped, swallowed. He lingered 3 days. In pain the whole time, I promised Ma I'd take care of him, and I failed. You were young yourself, old enough to know better. After that, I never could look at that girl again. Never could look at any woman without remembering the price of my selfishness. He set down his cup, rubbed his face. Maybe that's why I wrote those letters. Figured a stranger might not see the failure in me right off. Margaret reached out, hesitated, then placed her hand over his. We're all failures. Thomas, the lucky ones get a chance to fail better next time. He turned his hand palm up, fingers closing gently around hers. They sat that way, holding hands in the dark like young sweethearts, though youth had long passed them by. A week later, the storm hit. Margaret woke to howling wind and snow driving horizontal past the window. Thomas burst through the door in a whirl of snow. Blizzard coming, need to get the stock to shelter. She dressed quickly, layering everything she owned. Outside, the world had turned white and violent. She could barely see Thomas 10 feet ahead as they fought their way to the barn. The horses were wild-eyed with fear, the cattle bawling. Together they drove them into the barn, Thomas shouting instructions the wind tried to steal. By the time they'd secured the animals, Margaret couldn't feel her feet. Thomas half carried her back to the cabin, her skirts frozen stiff as armor. Inside, he knelt before her, pulling off her boots and socks with careful hands. "Frostbite," he muttered, seeing her blue-white toes. "This'll hurt." He rubbed her feet between his hands, and she bit back a cry as feeling returned in pins and needles. He worked silently, thoroughly, until color returned. "Better?" he asked, looking up at her. She nodded, unable to speak. The intimacy of the moment, him kneeling before her, cradling her feet, made her chest tight. The blizzard raged for 2 days. Thomas moved in from the barn by necessity, sleeping on the floor by the fire. They were trapped in their small world of warmth, while winter tried to claw its way in. Margaret read to him from her Bible and her one book of poetry. He told her stories of his childhood, before loss had carved him hollow. They played cards with a worn deck, and she learned he had a competitive streak that made her laugh. The second night, she woke to find him adding wood to the fire. In the flickering light, she studied his profile, the strong nose, the lines that spoke of sun and sorrow, the careful way he moved to avoid waking her. "I'm glad I came," she said softly. He turned, surprised. "Even with—" He gestured toward the storm rattling the walls. "Especially with—" She sat up, blanket around her shoulders. "I've been alone in comfortable rooms. Thomas, this is better." He crossed to her, knelt again beside the bed. "Margaret, He stopped, started again. "I'm no good with words. But I want you to know, you're safe here. With me. Always." She touched his face, feeling the rasp of beard, the warmth of skin. "I know." He caught her hand, pressed it against his cheek. For a moment, they stayed frozen that way, on the edge of something new. Then he stood, stepped back. "Storm's breaking," he said roughly. "Should be clear tomorrow." But something else had broken too, the careful walls they'd built. Margaret lay back, listening to him settle by the fire, and felt hope unfurl in her chest like the first green shoot through snow. Tomorrow they would dig out, tend the stock, return to their careful dance of proximity and distance. But tonight, in their snowbound cabin, they'd been what they were meant to be, two souls finding shelter in each other against the storm. The fever came without warning. Margaret had spent the day repairing fence lines alongside Thomas, learning to stretch wire taut despite the cold that made metal burn bare skin. By evening, her head pounded and her limbs felt weighted with lead. She said nothing, serving supper as usual. But Thomas noticed her trembling hands. "You're ill," he said, statement rather than question. "Just tired." But even as she spoke, the room tilted sideways. The last thing she remembered was Thomas's alarmed face before darkness claimed her. She woke to find herself in the bed, layers of quilts piled atop her, yet still shivering. Thomas sat beside her, pressing a cool cloth to her burning forehead. His face was haggard, beard unkempt, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "How long?" she whispered through cracked lips. 3 days. His voice was hoarse. "Fever broke twice, came back worse. I thought—" He stopped, jaw working. "Drink this." He helped her sit, supporting her against his chest while she sipped water. She could feel the solid warmth of him through her nightgown, the careful strength of his arms. When had he changed her clothes? The intimacy of it, him caring for her body while she lay insensible, should have shamed her. Instead, she felt only a bone-deep gratitude. The fever returned in waves. Sometimes she woke to daylight, sometimes darkness, always to find Thomas there. He spooned broth between her lips, bathed her face and arms with the snow-cooled water, held her when chills racked her body so violently she feared her bones would shatter. In her delirium, she spoke without restraint. The baby had hair, she told him, clutching his hand. Dark hair, like wet silk, so small. My hands could cover him entire. They wouldn't let me hold him. Said it was better that way. Hush now, Thomas murmured, stroking her hair back from her damp forehead. Rest. But the fever had broken down her careful walls, and the words poured out. She told him about the blood that wouldn't stop, the doctor who'd looked at her with disgust, the priest who'd refused to baptize her son. She told him about walking Chicago's streets afterward, hoping the winter would take her too, only to find her traitorous body insisting on survival. When lucidity returned, she found Thomas asleep in the chair beside the bed, one hand still holding hers. In the lamplight, she could see the toll her illness had taken, the deeper lines around his eyes, the slump of exhaustion in his shoulders. He'd neglected himself entirely for her care. She tried to sit up, and he woke instantly. Margaret, her name was a prayer on his lips. You're back. I'm sorry, she whispered. The things I said, nothing to apologize for. He helped her sit, piling pillows behind her. How do you feel? Weak, but clear. She looked at their joined hands. You've been here the whole time? Where else would I be? The simplicity of it undid her. Tears came then, silent and healing. Thomas didn't try to stop them, just held her hand and waited. When she was spent, he brought warm water and a cloth, helped her wash her face and hands. The tenderness in his touch made her chest ache. You need to eat, he said. I'll heat soup. Thomas, she caught his sleeve as he turned away. Thank you. He looked at her for a long moment. You scared me, Margaret. I've lost too much already. I couldn't. He shook his head. Just get well. Recovery was slow. Margaret chafed at her weakness, at hands that shook holding a spoon, at legs that wobbled after a few steps. Thomas wouldn't let her resume her duties, taking on cooking and washing atop his own work. She watched from the bed as he moved about the cabin, noting the quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice at self-sufficiency. One afternoon, she felt strong enough to sit in the rocking chair by the fire. Thomas had brought in her sewing basket, and she was attempting to darn socks when he returned from town. Snow dusted his shoulders, and his expression was grim. What is it? She asked. He set down the supplies, not meeting her eyes. Talk in town. About us? About me keeping you here improper-like. Margaret's stomach clenched. What kind of talk? The kind that says I'm taking advantage. That you're... He stopped, fists clenching. That you're no better than you should be. Staying here without marriage lines. We've been waiting for the preacher. I know that. You know that. But folks see what they want to see. He finally looked at her, pain raw in his eyes. I won't have your reputation ruined on my account. My reputation was ruined long ago, Margaret said quietly. That's why I'm here. Not to me, Thomas said fiercely. Never to me. The vehemence in his voice made her heart skip. She set aside the darning. What are you saying? He crossed to her, knelt as was becoming his habit, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. I'm saying we should go to Cheyenne. Get married proper by a judge. I know it ain't romantic, but... Yes, he blinked. Yes. Yes, Thomas, I'll marry you. She squeezed his hands. Romance is for young girls with unscarred hearts. I'd rather have truth. Something shifted in his face, walls crumbling. Margaret, I need you to understand. I'm not good at soft things. I don't know pretty words or how to court proper, but I swear to you, I'll work every day to be the husband you deserve. I don't want pretty words, she said. I want a man who sits by my sickbed for days without complaint, who defends my honor even when I have none left to defend, who treats me with kindness when the world offers only judgment. You have honor, he said roughly, more than anyone I've known. What happened to you? That was done to you, not by you. Don't ever think different. Margaret touched his face, feeling the warm skin, the pulse of life beneath. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Both of us thinking we're too damaged for love. Maybe that's why we fit, Thomas said, like broken pieces that make a whole. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Their first kiss was careful, almost chaste, a question asked and answered. But when he started to withdraw, she followed, deepening the contact. His hands came up to frame her face, and she felt years of loneliness crack and fall away like old paint. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. "I should—" Thomas gestured vaguely toward the door, face flushed. "You should stay," Margaret said. "You've been sleeping in that chair for days. Take the bed. I'll rest here. I couldn't—" "Thomas," she touched his hand. "We're to be married. We're both too old for propriety's sake alone. Sleep in a real bed. Please." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. That night, she dozed in the rocking chair while he slept properly for the first time in days. She woke once to find he'd risen and covered her with an additional blanket, and she smiled in the darkness. They went to Cheyenne 2 days later, the weather holding clear and cold. Margaret wore her best dress, a deep blue wool she'd saved for special occasions that had never come. Thomas had trimmed his beard and wore a clean white shirt she'd pressed with careful attention. The judge was a harried man who performed the ceremony between other cases, but Margaret didn't care. What mattered was Thomas's steady voice saying, "I do," the cool metal of his mother's ring sliding onto her finger, the legal weight of being declared man and wife. Afterward, they had a meal at the hotel, extravagant by their standards, with real china and cloth napkins. Thomas kept looking at her with something like wonder. "What is it?" she asked. "Just thinking how things turn. 6 months ago, I'd given up hope. Now here we are. Regrets?" she teased, though part of her truly wondered. He reached across the table, took her hand. "Never you?" She thought of Chicago, of cold rooms and colder looks, of a life circumscribed by shame. Never. They stayed the night at the hotel, Thomas's wedding gift to her, a night of luxury before returning to ranch life. They had adjoining rooms with a connecting door that stood open while they talked through the evening. When Margaret retired, she left the door ajar, a silent invitation. Near midnight, she heard him in the doorway. "Margaret, you awake?" "Yes." He entered slowly, a shadow in the darkness. I'm not sure how." She sat up, held out her hand. "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed, tension radiating from him. She could feel his fear, not of her, but of disappointing her, of doing wrong what should be right. "Thomas," she said gently, "we're not young lovers rushing toward passion. We're two people who found each other against all odds. There's no wrong way to be together." He turned to her then, and in the faint moonlight, she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "I haven't since I was young, and never with someone who mattered." "I matter. More than anything," he said simply. She drew him down beside her, and they lay facing each other in the darkness, learning the landscape of each other through careful touch. His hands shook as they traced her face, her shoulders, the curve of her waist. Her own exploration was equally tentative, the strong column of his throat, the broad planes of his chest, the scars that told stories of a hard life lived. When he kissed her, it was with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. They came together slowly, gently, with more tenderness than passion, two wounded souls finding healing in each other's arms. Afterward, they lay entwined, Margaret's head on his chest, listening to the strong beat of his heart. "My wife," Thomas said, wonder in his voice. "My husband," she replied, and felt him smile against her hair. They returned to the ranch as truly married, the legal bond matching what had been growing between them all along. But more than papers had changed. The careful distance was gone, replaced by small intimacies, a touch in passing, a kiss before morning chores, the warmth of shared sleep. That first night home, as they lay in the bed that was now theirs, Margaret said, "I love you, Thomas McAllister." He was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, roughly, "No one said that to me since Ma died." "Well, I'm saying it now, and I'll keep saying it until you believe it." He pulled her closer. pressed his face against her hair. "I love you too, Margaret. God help me. I don't know how to do it right, but I do. We'll learn together," she promised. "We have time." Outside, winter raged on, but inside their small cabin, spring had already come, tentative and fragile, but growing stronger each day. Two people who'd thought themselves too old, too damaged for love, had found it anyway, proving that sometimes the best things come to those who wait, even when the waiting seems endless. Spring arrived like a cautious visitor, testing the ground with warm days before retreating into frost. Margaret learned to read the Wyoming seasons in Thomas's movements, the way he studied the sky each dawn, the careful attention to which pastures cleared first, the precise timing of when to start seeds in boxes by the sunny window. They worked side by side now with an ease born of intimacy. Where once they'd moved around each other like polite strangers, now they flowed together, Margaret holding fence posts while Thomas drove them deep, Thomas steadying the ladder while she patched wind-torn sections of roof. Her hands had hardened, grown capable. She could split kindling, milk the cow they'd acquired, even help with calving when needed. "You've become a proper ranch woman," Thomas said one morning, watching her handle the chickens with confident efficiency. "Had a good teacher," she replied, which earned her one of his rare, full smiles. They'd developed a rhythm to their days, dawn chores together, breakfast where they planned the day's work, then separate tasks until noon dinner. Afternoons might find them riding the boundary lines. Thomas had taught her to sit a horse properly, or working together on whatever project demanded attention. Evenings were for quiet companionship, the kind of peaceful silence only possible between people who no longer needed words to communicate. It was on such an evening that Margaret opened the journal she'd begun keeping. "Writing more letters?" Thomas asked from where he was oiling a bridle. "No, just thoughts, memories, things I don't want to forget." He was quiet for a moment. "Good memories, I hope." She looked at him. This man who'd given her a second life, the best. The journal had become her confidant, the place where she could explore the miracle of her transformation. She wrote, "April 15th, found the first wildflowers today. Tiny purple things pushing through dead grass. Thomas says they're pasque flowers, always the first to bloom. He picked one and tucked it behind my ear, then blushed as if we were courting youngsters. After all we've shared, he still has this sweetness about him. I pressed the flower between these pages. Someday, perhaps, I'll show a daughter how her father courted me with wildflowers." The thought stopped her pen. A daughter. At her age, the idea was foolishness. And yet, they'd never discussed children, both perhaps assuming that ship had sailed. But her body, strengthened by hard work and good food, had surprised her by resuming its monthly courses with regularity. Was it possible? She said nothing to Thomas, not wanting to burden him with impossible hopes. Instead, she threw herself into spring work with renewed vigor. They rebuilt the chicken coop, strung new wire, planted a larger kitchen garden. Thomas had given her free rein with the household money, trusting her judgment. And she managed it carefully, trading eggs for fabric, selling her fine needlework to the mercantile, making every penny stretch. The day the circuit preacher came through Willow Creek, they attended services together. It was their first appearance as a married couple in the small church, and Margaret felt the weight of curious stares. But when Reverend Patterson called for announcements and Thomas stood, her heart swelled. "I'd like folks to know that Margaret and I were properly married by Judge Thornton in Cheyenne last month," he said, his voice carrying clear and strong. "Any man who speaks ill of my wife will answer to me." The silence that followed was profound. Then old Mrs. Hutchinson, 90 if she was a day, cackled from the front pew. "About time. McAllister. Thought you'd pine away alone forever." A ripple of laughter broke the tension. After services, several women approached Margaret, tentatively, but with genuine warmth. Mary Patterson, the preacher's wife, pressed her hand. Marriage suits you both, she said simply. Welcome to our community. Proper-like. It wasn't full acceptance. Some still whispered, still judged. But it was a beginning. May brought an unexpected visitor. Margaret was hanging wash when she saw a rider approaching, and something about the set of his shoulders made her stomach clench. Thomas was in the far pasture, too distant to call. The man who dismounted was well dressed, out of place against the ranch's rustic backdrop. When he removed his hat, Margaret's heart stopped. James Pemberton. Older, harder, but unmistakably the man who'd fathered her lost child. Margaret, he said her name like he had the right to it. You look, well. She gripped the wet shirt in her hands, fighting the urge to run. Mr. Pemberton, you're far from Chicago. Business in California. Heard through mutual acquaintances you'd come west. Thought I'd see how you were faring. His eyes traveled over her work-worn dress, her weathered hands. This is quite a change from the Pemberton household. An improvement, she said coldly. He stepped closer, and she smelled bay rum cologne, a scent that once made her heart race but now turned her stomach. Margaret, I've had time to think. What happened between us? I handled it badly. I was young, frightened. You were engaged to another woman. She cut him off. You made promises you never intended to keep, and when consequences came, you let your mother throw me into the street. I've left my wife. The words hung between them like a challenge. I could make things right now, take you away from this. He gestured dismissively at the ranch. You deserve better than exile and hard labor. For a moment, Margaret saw it. The life that might have been comfort, society, an easier path. Then she heard Thomas's horse approaching and felt only relief. Thomas dismounted slowly, taking in the scene. His hand didn't go to his gun, but Margaret knew he'd noted every detail of the stranger's appearance. Thomas, this is Mr. Pemberton from Chicago, she said steadily. He was passing through. Mr. Pemberton, my husband, Thomas McAllister. She watched understanding dawn in Thomas's eyes. Who this man was, what he'd meant to her. His face went carefully blank. Mr. Pemberton. Thomas nodded once, curtly. Long way from Chicago. Indeed. James looked between them, clearly reassessing. I was just telling Margaret. My wife, Thomas interrupted quietly, has work to do. If you've said your piece, best be moving on. The two men faced each other, and Margaret saw James realize that despite the fine clothes and softer living, he was no match for Thomas's work-hardened strength and fierce protectiveness. Of course, James turned back to Margaret. If you change your mind, I won't. She moved to stand beside Thomas, her hand finding his. I have everything I need right here. James's face twisted briefly. Hurt pride, perhaps, or genuine regret. Then he mounted and rode away without looking back. Margaret stood watching until he disappeared over the rise, then turned to find Thomas studying her with unreadable eyes. You all right? He asked. She considered the question honestly. Yes, seeing him again, I thought it would hurt more, but it was like looking at a stranger. That girl who loved him, she doesn't exist anymore. If you wanted to go, Thomas McAllister, you stop that right now. She grabbed his shirt front, forcing him to look at her. I chose you. I choose you every morning when I wake up and every night when I go to sleep. That man offers me nothing but a return to shame. You gave me dignity, purpose, love. How can you even question? He kissed her then, hard and desperate, and she tasted fear in it, fear of loss, of not being enough. When they broke apart, she kept her hands fisted in his shirt. I love you, she said fiercely. Not because you saved me, not because I had nowhere else to go. I love you because you're the best man I've ever known. Because you see me, not what was done to me, not what I lost, but me. Don't you dare doubt that. Margaret, he said roughly, and she heard years of loneliness in her name. I'm sorry. When I saw him, looking like everything I'm not, he's nothing, she said firmly. A shadow from a life that led me to you. I wouldn't change a single step of that path, no matter how painful, because it brought me here. That night, they made love with an intensity born of renewed commitment, each touch a promise, each kiss a vow. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Margaret found the courage to voice her secret hope. "Thomas, what would you say to the possibility of children?" His hand, which had been stroking her hair, stilled. "Children, but I thought your age." "I'm 39, not 60, she said, trying for lightness. "Women have babies at my age, and I've been feeling different lately, stronger, more myself than I've been in years. You want children? After what you went through?" She turned in his arms to face him. "I want your children. I want to see a little boy with your eyes, or a girl with your stubborn chin. I want to fill this house with laughter and chaos and life, but only if you want it too." He was quiet so long she feared she'd asked too much. "Then, I gave up on that dream long ago. Figured I'd missed my chance at family, but if you're willing—" "Margaret, there's nothing I'd want more than to see you holding our baby." Hope bloomed in her chest, painful in its intensity. "It might not happen. I might be too old, too damaged. Then we'll have each other," he said simply. "That's already more than I ever thought to have." Spring deepened into summer, and with it came a sense of possibility neither had felt in years. They expanded the garden, planning for a future that might include more mouths to feed. Thomas built a cradle in the evenings, working the wood smooth as silk, saying nothing about its purpose. Margaret sewed tiny garments, tucking them away in her trunk, afraid to jinx the hope growing as steadily as the corn in their fields. The ranch prospered under their combined care. The cattle grew fat on good grass, the chickens laid abundantly, the garden promised a bountiful harvest. Even the townspeople seemed to soften, especially after Margaret nursed the Morrisons' youngest through a dangerous fever, sitting up 3 nights until the crisis passed. "You've got healing hands, Mrs. Morrison said, tears in her eyes as her boy smiled weakly from his sickbed. "I'm sorry for how I treated you when you first came. We all deserve second chances," Margaret replied, thinking of her own transformation. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold, Margaret felt a flutter in her belly. She went very still, hand pressed to her stomach, hardly daring to breathe. "What is it?" Thomas asked, instantly alert. She took his hand, placed it where hers had been. They waited, breathless, and then, there, a tiny movement, like a butterfly testing new wings. "Is that—" Thomas's voice was wondering. "I think so." Tears ran down her face, but they were pure joy. "I think so." He pulled her onto his lap, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. "When?" "Winter, I think. December, maybe January. A Christmas baby," he said softly. "Margaret, are you sure?" She nodded, laughing and crying at once. "I've been sure for weeks, but afraid to hope. But that movement, Thomas, we're going to have a baby." He buried his face in her neck, and she felt him tremble. When he raised his head, his eyes were wet. "I don't deserve this," he said roughly. "Don't deserve you or this chance. Stop." She framed his face with her hands. "We both deserve happiness. We've earned it with every lonely year, every loss, every moment we kept going when it would have been easier to quit. This baby is our reward for surviving long enough to find each other." They sat together as stars emerged in the darkening sky, hands linked over the promise of new life. The journey that had brought them together, all the pain and loneliness and seemingly wasted years, had led to this moment of perfect possibility. "I love you, Mrs. McAllister," Thomas said against her hair. "And I love you, Mr. McAllister," she replied, "forever and always." The night wind carried the scent of growing things, of earth and hope and dreams taking root. And in her womb, their child grew, proof that love could bloom at any age, in any season, for those brave enough to accept its gift. The influenza came to Willow Creek in September, carried by a traveling salesman who collapsed in Morrison's store, Within a week, half the town was bedridden, burning with fever and racked with coughs that echoed through the night like death rattles. Dr. Hammond, the closest physician in Cheyenne, sent word he was overwhelmed with cases there. The town was on its own. Margaret, now visibly pregnant, wanted to help, but Thomas was adamant. "You're not risking yourself or the baby," he said, fear making his voice sharp. "I've already lost too much. I won't lose you." But when the Morrison children fell ill, the same boy Margaret had nursed months before, she couldn't stand idle. "I'll be careful," she promised Thomas, "but I have some skill with nursing. I can't let children suffer when I might help." They compromised. Margaret prepared broths and medicines in their kitchen, while Thomas delivered them. But as the deaths began, first old Mr. Hutchinson, then the baker's wife, then a child barely walking, the situation grew desperate. The tiny church became a makeshift hospital, and there weren't enough hands to tend the sick. It was Thomas who finally said, "We have to do more." They worked in shifts, Margaret tending the less critical cases while wearing a cloth mask soaked in camphor, Thomas handling the worst cases and the dead. They moved through days that blurred together, marked only by who still breathed and who had passed. Margaret's journal entries from this time were brief, exhausted. September 20th. Lost the Patterson boy today. His mother hasn't stopped crying. Thomas buried him beside his sister. 7 graves now. September 23rd. My back aches constantly. Baby moves less. Please, God, let this pass. Let us survive. September 26th. Thomas coughing. Won't admit he's ill. Made him rest. Taking his shifts. God give me strength. The crisis broke in early October. Fever's fading. The coughing easing. Of the town's 100 souls, they'd lost 12. Margaret stood in the cemetery, one hand on her swollen belly, reading words over the graves while Reverend Patterson was still too weak to stand. Thomas stood beside her, hollow-eyed but recovered. It was as they walked home that Margaret heard it, a familiar voice among the volunteers who'd come from neighboring towns to help. She turned to see a woman in a worn dress and familiar gray eyes. Hannah Sullivan, now Hanson, her friend from the Chicago years. Margaret? Margaret O'Brien. They embraced carefully, Margaret's belly between them. Hannah's eyes widened. But I heard... She stopped, flustered. That is, after you left Chicago. There were stories. I'm Mrs. McAllister now. Margaret said firmly. This is my husband, Thomas. Hannah's expression shifted through surprise to genuine pleasure. Oh, Margaret, I'm so glad. After what happened, we all felt terrible about how you were treated. I tried to find you. They talked as they walked, Hannah explaining she'd come west with her husband after his business failed. She'd trained as a nurse, heard about Willow Creek's crisis, and came to help. But Margaret noticed how Hannah's eyes kept returning to her belly, calculating months and possibilities. That evening, as Margaret rested her swollen feet, Thomas asked, "Will she bring trouble, knowing your past?" Margaret considered. Hannah was kind to me when few were, but people talk, stories travel. She took his hand. I'm not ashamed anymore. Let them count months if they must. This baby was conceived in marriage, in love. That's all that matters. But as October waned, whispers began. Hannah had been discreet, but others made connections. A governess dismissed in scandal. A hasty departure, now pregnant mere months after marriage. The arithmetic was damning in minds eager to judge. It came to a head at the Harvest Festival. Margaret had baked pies for the church booth, proud of pastry skills learned through necessity. She was arranging them when she heard Mrs. Carter, wife of the man Thomas had knocked down, speaking loudly nearby. Convenient, isn't it? Shows up already carrying and finds a fool lonely enough to take her in. McAllister might think he's got himself a wife, but what he's really got is another man's... She never finished. Margaret turned to find Thomas standing behind Mrs. Carter, his face carved from stone. Finish that sentence, he said quietly, and you'll be picking your teeth out of the dirt. The woman paled but raised her chin. Just speaking truth, everyone's thinking. Then let me speak some truth, Thomas said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. Any child my wife bears is mine. Mine to raise, mine to love, mine to protect. And any soul who says otherwise will answer to me. That clear enough for everyone? Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as he crossed to her, took her arm with infinite gentleness, and led her away from the stunned crowd. They drove home in silence, but his hand held hers the entire way. That night, as they lay together, she said, "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." He placed his hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift and kick. "This child is ours. Margaret, I don't care what anyone thinks or says. From the moment you told me, this became my child, our miracle." Winter arrived early, and with it, Margaret's time drew near doctor. Hammond made a special trip from Cheyenne to check on her, pronouncing her healthy despite her age. "First babies are unpredictable," he warned. "Could come early, could come late. You'll need someone with experience when the time comes." Hannah volunteered immediately. She'd moved to Willow Creek permanently, her nursing skills desperately needed. Despite the gossip her presence had inadvertently sparked, Margaret was grateful for her friend's steady competence. The first pains came on December 20th, as a blizzard howled outside. Thomas had been watching her like a hawk for days, and when she gasped and gripped the table edge, he was beside her instantly. "It's time?" She nodded, breathing through the contraction. "Get Hannah, and Thomas, don't leave me." "Never," he promised. What followed were the longest hours of both their lives. The labor was hard, complicated by Margaret's age and the baby's size. Hannah worked with calm efficiency while Thomas never left Margaret's side, letting her grip his hands until they went numb, wiping her face, whispering encouragement when she said she couldn't continue. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her as she wept with exhaustion. "You survived everything to get here. You can do this." As dawn broke on December 21st, their daughter entered the world with a cry that seemed to shake the rafters. Hannah placed the baby on Margaret's chest, and time stopped. She was perfect, dark hair like wet silk, Thomas's stubborn chin, Margaret's eyes, and alive, gloriously, miraculously alive. "A girl," Margaret whispered, touching the tiny fingers that gripped with surprising strength. "Thomas, we have a daughter." He was crying openly, unashamed. "She's beautiful, perfect, like her mother." "What will you name her?" Hannah asked. Cleaning up quietly, Margaret looked at Thomas. They'd discussed names, but now, holding their child, only one seemed right. "Hope," she said. "Hope, Elizabeth McAllister, for the future, and for the past that brought us together." Thomas traced their daughter's cheek with one trembling finger. "Hello? Hope, I'm your papa, and I promise you, little one, you'll never doubt for a moment that you're loved." The days that followed were a blur of wonder. Margaret healed slowly but well, while Thomas proved a devoted father, changing diapers with the same careful attention he gave to mending fence, singing old lullabies his mother had taught him while Hope slept against his chest. The town's reaction was mixed. Some, like the Morrisons and Pattersons, brought gifts and genuine congratulations. Others maintained their whispered doubts. But when Reverend Patterson baptized Hope on a bright January morning, the church was full. Whatever the gossips might say, a baby had a way of softening hearts. "She looks just like Thomas. Old Mrs." Hutchinson declared loudly, peering at Hope's face. "Got his stubborn look already." It became a kind of town joke, how much Hope resembled her father, whether from kindness or genuine belief. People began to see Thomas in the baby's features, the gossip gradually dying under the weight of apparent evidence. One evening in late January, as snow fell soft outside and Hope slept in her cradle, Margaret found Thomas staring at their daughter with wonder. "What are you thinking?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," he said. "6 months ago, I had nothing but land and loneliness. Now I have you, our daughter, a real home. Sometimes I wake up afraid it's all a dream." She kissed his cheek. "It's real. We're real. And we're just beginning." He turned in her arms, kissed her properly. "I love you, Margaret McAllister. Thank you for saving my life." "We saved each other," she corrected. "That's what love does." Hope stirred in her sleep, making small sounds that drew both parents to hover over the cradle. Their daughter, their miracle, was living proof that sometimes the longest roads led to the greatest destinations. Margaret thought of another baby, born too soon, lost too quickly. That grief would always be part of her, but now it shared space with joy so profound it took her breath. She'd traveled across a continent, faced judgment and hardship, found love when she'd thought it impossible, and now she held the future in the form of a tiny girl who would grow up certain of her place in the world, surrounded by love that had been worth the wait. "Let's take her to see the stars," Thomas suggested suddenly. "It's clear tonight." They bundled Hope warmly and stepped onto the porch. The winter sky blazed with stars, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. Their breath clouded in the cold air as they stood together, their daughter safe between them. "Make a wish," Thomas said. Margaret looked at her husband. Their child, the life they'd built from loneliness and courage. "I have everything I could wish for." Then wish for hope, for her future. Margaret kissed their daughter's head, breathing in the sweet baby scent. "I wish for you to know how wanted you are," she whispered. "How loved? How your papa and I waited our whole lives to meet each other and make you. I wish for you to be brave and kind and strong. But mostly, I wish for you to always know you're home." Hope opened her eyes then, seeming to look straight at the stars, and Margaret could have sworn she smiled. Spring returned to Wyoming with Hope McAllister, now 6 months old, a happy baby whose laughter filled the cabin like music. Margaret had taken to wearing her in a sling while working, the baby content to watch her mother's movements with serious gray eyes that missed nothing. Thomas swore she was already trying to talk, though Margaret insisted the babbling was just sounds. Still, when Hope reached for him, calling, "Pa, pa," his face lit up like sunrise. The day Reverend Patterson asked Margaret to teach the local children was a turning point. The small schoolhouse had been closed since the previous teacher married and moved away, leaving a dozen children without education. "You were a governess," the Reverend said. "You have the learning and the patience. The town needs you." Margaret looked at Thomas, who nodded. "Do it," he said. "You've got gifts that shouldn't be wasted." So Margaret became the unofficial teacher of Willow Creek, holding classes 3 days a week while Hannah or Mrs. Morrison watched Hope. She taught reading and arithmetic, but also harder lessons about kindness, about judging others, about how a person's worth wasn't measured by their past but by their actions. The children adored her, even the older boys, initially resentful of a woman's authority, fell under her spell when she read them adventure stories and taught them to write their own. The girls especially flourished, particularly when Margaret spoke frankly about women's capabilities. "You can be more than wives and mothers," she told them one afternoon, causing a minor scandal that reached parents' ears. "You can be both, or neither, or anything in between. Your value isn't determined by marriage or children, but by the strength of your character and the good you do in the world." Young Sarah Morrison went home that night and announced she wanted to be a doctor. Her mother appeared at Margaret's door the next morning. "What are you filling my daughter's head with, Mrs. Morrison demanded, though her tone lacked its old venom. "Possibilities," Margaret replied calmly. Hope balanced on her hip. "The same possibilities I wish I'd known about at her age." "Mrs." Morrison stared at her for a long moment. "I was taught a woman's place was set in stone. So was I. But stones can be moved, given enough determination." Margaret shifted Hope to her other hip. "Your Sarah's bright as a new penny. Why limit what she might become?" The woman left thoughtful. and Sarah continued attending classes with her mother's grudging support. Thomas, meanwhile, had expanded their operation. With the help of a hired hand, young Ben Foster, orphaned in the influenza outbreak, they'd acquired more cattle and improved the breeding stock. The ranch was prospering, and Thomas had begun planning additions to the cabin. "Hope needs her own room soon," he said one evening, sketching rough plans. "And maybe," he glanced at Margaret, "maybe she won't be the only child needing space." Margaret smiled, her hand moving to her belly where, though not yet showing, their second child grew. "I was wondering when you'd notice." Thomas crossed to her in 2 strides, kneeling before her chair. "Truly? Truly. Hannah confirmed it yesterday. Due in November. She thinks—" He pressed his face against her stomach, and she felt him trembling. "Another miracle. We're becoming quite good at miracles," she teased, running her fingers through his hair. That Sunday, they attended church as a family, Hope charming everyone with her gummy smiles and reaching hands. Even the holdout gossip seemed to have accepted the McAllisters' place in the community. Margaret's work with the children, Thomas's help during the influenza crisis, and Hope's undeniable presence had woven them into the fabric of Willow Creek. It was after the service that trouble arrived. Margaret was helping serve the communal meal when she noticed a stranger talking to Thomas. Something about the man's bearing, arrogant, aggressive, made her uneasy. She handed Hope to Hannah and approached. "No, you've done well here. McAllister," the man was saying. "But times are changing. Smart men are selling to the consortium now. While the prices are good." "Not interested," Thomas said flatly. The man, who'd introduced himself as Garrett Walsh from the Eastern Land Company, smiled thinly. "You haven't heard my offer." "Don't need to. This land isn't for sale." Walsh's eyes found Margaret. "Mrs. McAllister, I've heard about you. Quite a story. Coming west for a new start." His tone made it clear what kind of story he'd heard. "Must be difficult, maintaining a ranch with a growing family. My company could make your lives much easier." "Our lives are plenty easy," Margaret said coolly. "We have everything we need." "Do you?" Walsh's smile sharpened. "From what I hear, your husband's had this land for years without proper documentation. Homestead claims can be complicated, especially when questions arise about the claimant's character or associations." The threat was subtle but clear. Thomas stepped forward, but Margaret caught his arm. "Mr. Walsh," she said pleasantly, "my husband's claim is ironclad. Filed proper and legal. As for character, I'd put his against any man's, including those who make veiled threats at church socials. Now, if you'll excuse us, our daughter needs feeding." They walked away, but Margaret could feel Walsh's eyes following them. That night, Thomas checked and rechecked his land papers while Margaret wrote in her journal. June 18th. Trouble has found our paradise. This Walsh represents everything we came west to escape. Greed dressed up as progress. Threats wrapped in smiles. But we've come too far to be frightened off now. This is our home, built with our hands and hearts. Let them come. We'll stand. Walsh didn't leave town. He took a room at the boarding house, spent his days asking questions, spreading money around for information. Within a week, the old stories about Margaret surfaced with new venom. Walsh had done his research, even producing a Chicago newspaper clipping about the governess dismissed in scandal. The campaign was insidious. Suddenly, parents wondered if Margaret should be teaching their children. Men questioned whether Thomas was thinking clearly, bewitched by a fallen woman. The ugliness they'd overcome returned tenfold, poisoning the community's hard-won peace. It culminated at the Independence Day celebration. Margaret had helped organize the event, Hope now walking unsteadily and delighting everyone with her determined toddle. The pie contest, the races, the dancing, all proceeded normally until Walsh stood on the platform, calling for attention. "Good people of Willow Creek," he began, voice carrying across the square. "I've come to offer prosperity, to bring your town into the modern age. But I find certain elements resistant to progress, elements whose past behavior might shock you." He held up papers. Affidavits, he claimed, from Chicago citizens attesting to Margaret's low character. As he began to read, Thomas pushed through the crowd, but Margaret reached the platform first. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through his performance. "Just stop." She faced the crowd, her neighbors, the people who'd become her community. Some looked away, ashamed. Others watched with pity or judgment or simple curiosity. "Yes," Margaret said clearly. "I was dismissed from my position in Chicago. Yes, I bore a child out of wedlock, a child who died, who I mourned alone. Yes, I came west because I had nowhere else to go." She lifted her chin. "But I've hidden nothing from my husband. He knew my past and chose to love me anyway. We've built a life here, contributed to this community, raised our daughter among you." She turned to Walsh. "This man thinks my past makes me weak, makes us vulnerable. He's wrong. I've survived shame and loss and judgment. I've learned to split wood and birth calves and teach children their letters. I've held your sick during the influenza, helped bury your dead. I am not the woman who left Chicago in disgrace. I am Margaret McAllister, teacher, mother, rancher's wife, and I will not be driven away by a man who sees only profit where we see home." The silence stretched taut. Then Hannah stepped forward. "Margaret nursed my boy through fever. I don't care what she did before. Mrs. Morrison joined her. "She saved my son's life, taught my daughter to dream. That matters more than old gossip." One by one, people stepped forward. Not all. Some slunk away, unwilling to challenge Walsh openly. But enough. The tide turned, and Walsh found himself facing a community that chose loyalty over scandal. "This isn't over," he snarled at Thomas. "I'll have that land one way or another." Thomas smiled coldly. "Try it. But know this. I've got a wife who faced down her past in front of the whole town, a daughter learning to walk, and another child coming. I'll die before I let you take what's theirs." Walsh left town that night, but Margaret knew he'd return. Men like that always did. For now, though, they'd won. The community that had whispered behind her back now surrounded them with protective solidarity. That evening, as fireworks lit the sky, Margaret stood with her family on the edge of the celebration. Hope slept against Thomas's shoulder while Margaret leaned into his side, feeling the baby move within her. "You were magnificent today," Thomas said quietly. "Facing them all down like that. I was terrified," she admitted. "But also free. No more secrets, no more wondering when the past would catch up. It's all in the open now. Regrets." She looked at their sleeping daughter, at the man who'd given her a second chance at life. "Never let Walsh come back with his threats and schemes. We've faced worse and survived. We'll survive this too." The school resumed with full attendance, parents making a point of support. Margaret taught with renewed purpose, using her own story when appropriate, to the older girls. She spoke honestly about consequences and choices. To all the children, she emphasized resilience and redemption. "Everyone makes mistakes," she told them. "What matters is what you do next, how you rise from falling." One afternoon, Sarah Morrison stayed after class. "Mrs. McAllister, my ma told me what happened at the celebration, about your past and all." Margaret braced herself, but Sarah continued. "I think you're brave. Lots of folks would have run, but you stood up there and told the truth. That's what I want to be, someone who tells the truth even when it's hard." "The truth isn't always easy," Margaret said gently. "Sometimes it costs everything." "But you got everything too, didn't you?" Sarah gestured around the schoolroom, toward the ranch visible through the window. "You got a home and family and respect. Maybe not from everyone, but from the people who matter. From the mouths of babes." Margaret thought, "Yes, Sarah, I got everything that matters." As autumn approached and Margaret's pregnancy advanced, the ranch thrived. The additions to the cabin were complete, a room for Hope, another waiting for the new baby. Thomas had even built a small office where Margaret could prepare lessons and keep her journal. One evening, as she wrote while Hope played at her feet, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The woman who'd fled Chicago in disgrace would never have imagined standing before a crowd, claiming her past and her place. But that woman hadn't known Thomas's love, hadn't held her daughter, hadn't discovered her own steel spine. "Papa!" Hope called, and Thomas scooped her up, spinning her until she shrieked with laughter. "Careful," Margaret warned. "She just ate." "She's tough," Thomas said, but set her down gently, like her mother. Hope toddled to Margaret, patting her rounded belly with sticky hands. "Baby," she said clearly, her newest word. "That's right, sweet girl. Baby." Margaret kissed her daughter's head. "You're going to be a big sister." As if in response, the baby kicked strongly. Margaret gasped, and Thomas was beside her instantly. "All right?" "Yes, just active tonight." She took his hand, placed it where the movement was strongest. "Feel?" His face softened with wonder, the same expression he'd worn when Hope first moved within her. "Strong," he said. "Another fighter." "Has to be," Margaret said. "Born to McAllisters, raised in Wyoming. Fighting's in the blood." That night, as they lay together, Thomas traced patterns on her belly while Hope slept in her new room. "Walsh will come back," he said quietly. "Men like that don't give up easy." "I know." Margaret covered his hand with hers. "But we'll be ready. We have too much to lose now." "No," Thomas corrected. "We have too much to fight for. There's a difference." She turned to kiss him, tasting determination and promise. Outside, coyotes called across the darkness, but inside their expanded cabin, the McAllister family was safe and whole. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. A man who'd waited years for love, a woman who'd traveled miles to find it, and the children who were proof that some stories, no matter how unlikely their beginning, could still have happy ending. The teaching position, the community support, Hope's laughter, the baby growing. All of it was more than Margaret had dared dream when she'd stepped off that train in Cheyenne. She'd thought she was coming west to hide. Instead, she'd come to bloom, late but beautifully, in the harsh soil of Wyoming. Tomorrow there would be lessons to plan, chores to do, a life to live fully and openly. But tonight, wrapped in her husband's arms, listening to their daughter's peaceful breathing, feeling new life move within her, Margaret McAllister was exactly where she belonged. The years had been kind to the McAllister ranch. 5 winters had passed since Margaret first stepped off that train in Cheyenne, and the small cabin had grown into a proper homestead, where once a single room had sheltered 2 lonely souls. Now, a sprawling house rang with children's voices. Hope, at 4, was her father's shadow, following Thomas through his chores with determined steps. 2-year-old Samuel, named for Thomas's lost brother, toddled behind, clutching his sister's hand. And in Margaret's arms, baby Elizabeth gazed at the world with curious eyes. "Mama, look!" Hope called from where she was helping Thomas mend fence. "I can hammer too." Margaret smiled from the porch, adjusting Elizabeth on her hip. "Careful, sweetheart. Let Papa guide your hands." She watched Thomas patiently position the nail, his large hand covering Hope's small one. The sight still made her heart full. This man who'd waited so long for love, now surrounded by it. The school had grown too. What started as a dozen children in the old building now served 25, with families moving to Willow Creek specifically for their children's education. Margaret had trained Sarah Morrison as an assistant teacher. The girl, now 17, had indeed pursued her dream of learning medicine through correspondence courses while helping at the school. "Mrs. McAllister," Sarah said one afternoon as they prepared lessons. "Do you remember what you told me about stones being moved with determination?" "I remember." "Well, I've been accepted to the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia. Doctor. Hammond wrote me a recommendation." Margaret pulled the girl into a fierce embrace. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so proud of you." "It's because of you," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "You showed me it was possible to be more than what others expected." That evening, As Margaret shared the news with Thomas, he pulled her close. "You changed this town," he said. "Changed how people think." "The town changed me too," she replied. "Gave me purpose beyond what I'd imagined." Their peace was hard-won but solid now. Walsh's Eastern Land Company had tried twice more to force them out, once through legal channels that Thomas defeated with the help of a lawyer from Cheyenne, once through hired thugs who'd underestimated both Thomas's strength and Margaret's marksmanship. The sight of her standing on the porch, rifle steady, while Thomas faced down 3 men had become local legend. "Nobody messes with the McAllisters," had become a common saying in Willow Creek. But it wasn't fear that defined their place in the community. It was respect. The ranch prospered, employing several hands, including Ben Foster, who'd grown into a fine young man under their guidance. They'd taken in 2 more orphans from the influenza outbreak, raising them alongside their own children. Margaret's journal from this time reflected her wonder. November 3rd, Elizabeth took her first steps today, reaching from my arms to Thomas's. Hope cheered so loud she woke Samuel from his nap. I think of that frightened woman who arrived here 5 years ago and marvel. She could never have imagined this abundance of love, this sense of belonging so complete, it feels like I was born to it. The turning point for the town's final acceptance came during the drought of that 5th summer. Wells ran dry, crops withered, and cattle began dying. The McAllister Ranch, with its deep well and careful water management, was better positioned than most. Thomas didn't hesitate. "We share," he said simply when Margaret asked what they'd do. "Neighbors help neighbors." They opened their well to anyone who needed water, organized work crews to dig deeper wells elsewhere, shared their preserved food stores. Margaret turned the school into a community kitchen, teaching water conservation and desert survival techniques she'd learned through hard experience. When the rains finally came in September, Reverend Patterson held a service of thanksgiving. In his sermon, he spoke of providence and preparation, of community and charity. Then he asked Thomas and Margaret to stand. "These folks came to us as strangers," he said. "Some of us," his gaze found several faces in the crowd, "didn't welcome them as we should have, but they've shown us what Christian charity truly means. They've taught our children, healed our sick, shared their water in drought. If anyone doubts that God works through unlikely vessels, look at the McAllisters and think again." The applause was thunderous. Hope, sitting in Thomas's arms, clapped too, though she didn't understand why. Samuel hid his face in Margaret's skirt, overwhelmed by the noise. Baby Elizabeth slept through it all, peaceful against her mother's chest. After the service, the townspeople lingered, many approaching to shake hands or share words of gratitude. Mrs. Carter, the woman who'd once called Margaret terrible names, pressed a jar of preserves into her hands. "I was wrong," she said simply. "About everything. Can you forgive an old fool?" "There's nothing to forgive," Margaret replied. "We all have our journeys to make." That afternoon, the entire town gathered for a feast at the McAllister Ranch. Tables groaned under the weight of shared food. Children ran between the buildings, and music filled the air. Thomas had built a proper dance floor near the barn, and as evening fell, couples began to waltz under the stars. "Dance with me," Thomas said, appearing at Margaret's elbow. "I'm not sure I remember how." She laughed, but let him lead her onto the floor. They moved together with the ease of long partnership, her hand in his arm around her waist. Around them, their children played, Hope teaching Samuel a clapping game while Hannah Foster watched Elizabeth, the sight of their family, their community. Their life spread before her like a blessing she'd never dared imagine. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, noticing her tears. "That I'm home," she said simply. "Truly, completely home." As if summoned by the joy of the moment, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the celebration. Margaret stiffened, recognizing James Pemberton instantly despite the years. He looked older, harder, his fine clothes dusty from travel. Thomas felt her tension. "Want me to send him away?" "No," Margaret said after a moment. "I'll speak to him." She found James standing apart, watching the celebration with something like envy in his eyes. "Margaret," he began, but she held up a hand. "Why are you here?" I wanted to know you were well." He gestured at the scene before them. "You've built something remarkable." "We've built it," she corrected. "Thomas and I together." James was quiet for a long moment. "I have a letter," he said finally, pulling an envelope from his coat. "From your mother. She's dying. Margaret asked me to find you, to bring you this." Margaret took the letter with trembling hands, but didn't open it. "How did she know to send you?" "I've kept track of you. From a distance. I owed you that much. At least." He shifted uncomfortably. "I'm married now. 3 children. My wife, she knows about you. About us. She insisted I make this trip, to offer what amends I could." "There are no amends needed," Margaret said firmly. "What happened between us led me here. I wouldn't change a single step of that path." Hope's laughter rang out across the yard, and James's eyes followed the sound. "Your daughter?" "My eldest. I have 3 children now." Margaret lifted her chin. "All Thomases, all loved beyond measure." James studied Hope for a long moment, and Margaret saw him notice what others had, the girl's resemblance to Thomas, so strong it put old gossip to rest. What he couldn't know was that Margaret had prayed for that resemblance, and been granted it. Hope had Thomas's stubborn chin, his steady gaze, even his way of tilting her head when thinking. God's own statement on the matter of parentage. "I'm glad," James said quietly. "Glad you found happiness. It's more than I deserve to hope for you." "I didn't find happiness," Margaret corrected. "I built it, day by day, choice by choice. Now, if you'll excuse me, my husband is waiting." She left him standing in the shadows and returned to the light, to the music, to Thomas's welcoming arms. Later, she would read her mother's letter, full of regret and belated love, and would write back, offering forgiveness. But not tonight. Tonight was for celebrating the life she'd claimed against all odds. The party lasted until dawn, neighbors sleeping in the barn and under the stars. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Margaret stood on her porch, Thomas beside her, their children finally asleep inside. "No regrets?" he asked, as he had years before. "Only one," she said, and his face fell until she continued, "that it took so long to find you." He pulled her close, and they watched the sun climb higher, illuminating their land, their home, their future. In the distance, she could see the school where she'd taught a generation to think beyond limitations, the cemetery where they'd buried neighbors who'd become family, the main street where she'd once faced down her past and claimed her present. 5 years. 5 years since a damaged woman stepped off a train into the arms of a lonely man. Now they stood together, pillars of a community that had tested and ultimately embraced them. Their love, begun in middle age when most would say romance had passed them by, had bloomed into something richer than youthful passion, a partnership of souls who'd found each other across miles and years and sorrows. "I love you, Margaret McAllister," Thomas said against her hair. "And I love you, Thomas McAllister," she replied, "forever and always." From inside came the sound of Hope calling for breakfast, Samuel's answering chatter, Elizabeth's baby cries. The day was beginning, full of promise and purpose. There would be chores to do, lessons to plan, children to raise, a community to serve. But first, this moment, standing together in the morning light, grateful for the journey that had brought them home. Margaret thought of the woman who'd written that first letter, desperate and afraid, seeing only endings where beginnings waited. She wished she could tell that woman, "Be brave. The path ahead is hard but worth every step. Love waits for you in an unexpected place, with an unexpected man, at an unexpected time. Trust the journey." A meadowlark sang from the fence post, its liquid notes carrying across the awakening land. Margaret smiled, squeezed Thomas's hand, and went inside to start breakfast for her family. The greatest adventure of her life wasn't crossing the frontier. It was the daily choice to love and be loved, to build and rebuild, to never stop believing in second chances. The McAllister Ranch stood solid against the Wyoming sky. Proof that sometimes the best love stories begin not with once upon a time, but with after everything else failed. And in that beginning, two souls who'd thought themselves too old, too damaged, too late for love had found their happily ever after. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the American frontier, where love bloomed against all odds between Thomas and Margaret McAllister. We'd love to hear where you're listening to this story, whether it's during your commute, by a cozy fire, or perhaps under the stars like our pioneers of old. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of courage, romance, and redemption from America's untamed past. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Thomas and Margaret's story touched your heart? Until we meet again around the campfire, keep the spirit of the Old West alive in your hearts.